note before we get started. This conversation, I had an issue with the video recording, so it's going to be auditory only.
One factor you did talk about that was California specific that you did seem to say is a potential factor in homelessness, and I wanted to explore in a little more detail was housing costs. So that is one thing that California overall has, and San Francisco, it's a big problem in San Francisco, in the Bay Area in general. Um,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, in your experience and your research, what role does housing cost have? I mean, you have some people the book on abundance capitalism might be an example that would say housing cost is like one of the most important factors or the most important factor in contributing to homelessness. But yeah, what's your research? What's your experience been? What role does housing cost play?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are at least two sides or two dimensions. So, I mean, one, so there's a book by Greg Colburn and Clayton Alger called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And one of the things, important insights in that book is if you look at different states in the US, like, for example, in, West Virginia as a state ranks, among the highest or lowest, depending how you're looking at it, in terms of poverty, right? And we all know about Appalachia and so forth, but not a lot of unhoused people in that state. Maybe there's some reasons. Maybe it's because people have extended families. There might be some mitigating circumstance, but the important reason is that the housing costs are just not very expensive. So you have a state with very high levels of poverty, but relatively low levels of homelessness. That's probably true, I think, to some degree, even in Tennessee, where you and I both lived at the time. Yes, are there unhoused people? Yes, but not as a proportion of the population less than in places where the housing costs are expensive. So I think that there's something to the fact that housing costs are an issue, and the fact is that in the Bay Area, more so even than in Los Angeles, there have been very strong neighborhood groups that have tried to curtail any kind of development and just getting things built. There have been until very recently lots of logistical hurdles around that. Having said that, I take a little bit more of a jaundiced view of the whole kind of we build, like the kind of capitalist solution to this issue. Yes, I mean, supply and demand is a thing, but part of it is really, yes, we need to build more housing, 100%. But part of it is also we need to stop thinking of housing so much as an investment opportunity. I mean, that one of the things that's changed in the last 10 or 15 years is just the number of large corporations buying up large numbers of houses. I mean, so it's not the case anymore that I've got my house and someday I'll leave it to my kids or I'll sell it and go retire someplace. Yes, that happens, but the commodification of housing, the hyper commodification of housing, I can't help but think is part of the issue as well. And can markets play some roles? Sure, but I mean, but there's never going to be a point in which unsubsidized housing is going to house everybody in California or elsewhere. I mean, right? Market-based solutions are fine for certain segments of this population, but I'm skeptical of the idea that will then trickle down, and that there won't be any need of government assistance to keep people housed. I mean, I would love to be proven wrong about that, but I guess the point is I have a little bit more of a jaundiced view, as I was saying, of just if we just build and let the markets do their thing, then that will help. I mean, it's part of the solution, but certainly not all of it.
Yeah, I mean, this makes total sense. I could definitely see what you're saying about housing or real estate as an investment being maybe a core part of the problem. I think that like even on a basic level, the idea of buying this property under the expectation that the price will go up. That can work for that either company or individual or family or whatever, but that almost by necessity comes at the expense of whoever is going to inhabit that property later, whoever's going to either own or inhabit that property later. And I have felt like the housing market has long felt like a pyramid scheme almost. Like I've talked to people, I'm of the age where a lot of my friends are buying their first homes, and maybe this is kind of a classic millennial, people in their 30s kind of thing now. But like I just look through all the hoops they have to go through and all the different costs, and I'm like, it doesn't feel sustainable. And we've had housing crashes in 2009. Like it is a bubble that does burst and it has very bad impacts. But like it seems like it's a bubble, or it's almost like a pyramid scheme that's been propped up for decades to sustain typical Americans or typical home-owning Americans, which is already a pretty segmented group, but like for a long time. But yeah, I guess it doesn't. I could see the idea of like, okay, if we just build more in this system, it wouldn't necessarily help. Yeah, what do you think? If you're saying you think maybe some kind of building with public assistance, like what either kind of public assistance do you think would help, or what ways do you think what things do you think we could do to help kind of counteract this sense of housing as an investment and the problems that creates?
Yeah, and for full disclosure, I mean, I own a house, or I don't. The bank owns the house, but like, but I'm living in it and paying the bank. But so, just putting that out there. But I think there's several different strategies. I mean, one, if people were really serious about trying to address homelessness, one is we need to maybe rethink the kind of ideology of homeownership as kind of like the norm. That's not true in many other countries, or at least in urban environments. But here, in the exception of places maybe like New York and things like that, the expectation is at some point that you buy a house. And that's not, it's not strictly ideological in the sense that, that it has been, at least in the post-war period until probably pretty recently, was an important way of gaining generational wealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're investing in this thing and then you pass it on to your kids, that kind of thing. Whether that's going to be true going forward, I'm not sure. So some of the kind of things that we're currently doing, with housing vouchers and so forth, could be helpful. The other thing that that other countries are just doing a lot better job of than we are is, actually just taking the horse by the reins and building properties themselves, right? If you have vacant space, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a developer doing this for a profit type of thing. It can be, I guess. But that's always the model that we fall back on. We'll never achieve this, but the city of Vienna is just a great example of just an alternative view of housing. The city of Vienna owns, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80% of housing stock in the city, and it was a product of the socialist city council in the 1920s or teens. Everybody can afford most people can afford the housing because it's based on your income, so it's a portion of your income. And rather than having that be something like, because we have things like that here, like housing vouchers, but usually those are, there's a stigma attached to that, right? But if everybody can benefit from something that's similar to that, then the stigma goes away, right? And you eliminate, the other thing which we haven't talked about is just like the kind of unsustainable income disparity that we have in this country generally. Like the divide between rich and poor. And in places where you have housing that's made available in that kind of a model, like in Vienna, you can have fairly middle class or wealthy people living with people in the same building with people who are working class or whatever, and that's good. I can't help but think that that's good for society. Leaving aside like the housing issue and affordability, um, but but I think that that's also is part of the bigger picture. Is just like the income inequality is just completely out of, out of control. In other countries too, I think, but like certainly in the U.S. for sure.
Yeah, and it seems like I could be wrong on the data at the top of my head, but it seems like income inequality is currently getting worse in the United States.
Mhm.
It seems like it might be even going to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately. Um, can you maybe just for any viewer that might be unfamiliar with it, can you give the kind of the quick description of what a housing voucher is or how that works?
Oh, sure. So a housing voucher, I mean, it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a sort of a piece of paper, or it looks different at different places. But the idea is that you can take this voucher and you can go to a landlord, or usually an apartment, and you can present them with that document. And by and if the landlord agrees, then you can move into that apartment. And so the way it works is that you would pay 30% of your income for that apartment. And then the rest would be subsidized, usually at the state level. But it could be there are different kinds of schemes for that. Um, so that's basically how it would work, right? The problem is that it depend, the distribution of housing vouchers vary a lot by region and by place. They're for complicated reasons, and so people are on waiting lists to get the voucher, sometimes for a long time. And then when they get the voucher, as I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, then not all landlords accept them. So there's that kind of thing as well. But it has been effective for those that it works for.
Mm.
Because it is tied to your ability. It's always based on this kind of proportion of your income, and so the idea that the rent is going to be jacked up without your corresponding increase in your income is kind of off the table, which is always a concern. And when like when you rent an apartment or whatever, like you're always at the whim of the landlord. And they can. I mean, to be honest, I mean that was the thing that why I ended up like buying a place myself in the end. Is because like I've moved like hundreds of times, it seems like, throughout my life, and it's always because once the lease is up, you're just totally at the whim of the landlord. They can increase your rent by 50% if they want to or whatever. So yeah, so I think that I think that that's part of the issue as well. But that's basically what a housing voucher tries to accomplish. It's helping people enter kind of market rate housing, but by providing them with a subsidy.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like the subsidy is almost a ticket in, so they can start to be able to invest, like you said, because housing can be a way to build intergenerational wealth within the family, and it's something. There's a lot of history there, like there a lot of racism that can lead to certain groups have been historically excluded by that, not just racial groups, but it seems like this is kind of an entry into that so people can start to have that. Is that fair? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the other side of the coin, I mean, because in some ways, like getting people rehoused is a lot of work. The from a societal point of view, the better thing would be to keep people from becoming unhoused in the first place. And so there are different types of schemes around that. I mean, like guaranteed income, which is being done on very small scales in certain pockets of the U.S., but has been very successful in Mexico. I was just reading a report about these kind of guaranteed income for poor and very poor populations, and it's just lifted large portions of that population out of poverty. Brazil as well, especially in Rio. So the idea of just giving people money, the results of that are extraordinary. I mean, like that was one of the many tragic things that happened during COVID But the thing that to me is almost, well, that is among the tragic things is the innovative ideas that have gone by the wayside once COVID ended. Because one of those was, this kind of guaranteed income thing. I mean, people, there were moratoriums on evictions. There were, the federal government gave people checks, to keep people afloat in case they weren't working and so forth. And, as you probably heard, I mean, this wasn't the stated goal, but childhood poverty dropped by an extraordinary amount during COVID, like dropped by like, I don't know, a third or something, just because you were just giving people money so that they were, families were able to kind of support their kids and put food on the table and so forth. And I can't help but think that that probably also helped to keep people from, falling into homelessness, is that you had some kind of source of money that you could rely on.
Yeah.
Because keeping people in their home is a lot cheaper than getting them rehoused, 100%. And, I mean, especially when you think of like all the ancillary costs in terms of like damage to people's mental health, and like the fact that people are like, some start, taking up or increasing substance use as as a response to their current situation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I could see. I mean, being unhoused can produce a whole set of medical issues, ranging from mental health to physical health to just not being able to get certain types of medical care. So certain medical issues just become bigger, and that could have long-term implications. I could definitely see. It's like I could see if you can keep them housed, then it's just going to be a lot cheaper. But also, it seems like housing in some cases um, is seems like a gateway to a lot of other things in society. Like it seems like people who are housed have a lot easier of a job finding easier of a time finding a job. Have a lot easier of a time getting other types of resources in life that allow them to sustain themselves. Yeah. What were you gonna say?
Yes, I was just agreeing with you. I mean, getting a job, but also keeping a job, right? I mean, thinking of how different the challenges you would face as an unhoused person, keeping yourself clean to go to a job, right? Like you need to wash your clothes, like you don't want to smell like you were in a tent, that kind of thing. Um, so yeah, so that I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, the other thing is that because the other stereotype, and some stereotypes have their kernels of truth to them, right? Is the association of substance use, mental health and homelessness, right? And we can talk about like which came first or whatever, but if you have kind of a harm reduction approach to substance use and you have a housing first approach, I mean, there's a lot of research that shows that like if you get people stably housed, their substance use, I mean, it doesn't 100% that it's going to take care of itself, but that gives people kind of a space to be able to kind of reassess their lives and then kind of think about like, okay, maybe I need to like, stop using, or if I'm having mental health issues, maybe I need to kind of start prioritizing, this depression or a job facing, that kind of thing. And so, the model until fairly recently was the idea that you can't get into housing until you've stopped using drugs, right? But then that just keeps people from going in. We were talking before about the types of circumstances or barriers that keep people from getting housed, and that would certainly be one of them. Especially when the opposite is true, as I was saying, that if you get people stably housed, give them some level of support, a lot of times people will then have the initiative to try to address those issues, whether it's around addiction or those kind of things.
Mm. Yeah, this makes total sense. I could see. I mean, maybe this is a bit of a chicken and the egg. It doesn't of that. Sometimes the experiences of being homeless can lead to. Do you think, like you were hinting at this, but I know there's a lot of stereotypes about drug use among the homeless population, and I haven't like specifically studied this group of people, but it seems like a lot of that is just stereotypes and it's just wrong. But like, yeah, in your experience, do people, do you think homelessness can cause people to have substance abuse issues? Do you think do you think like really or do you think like really any connection between the two is just kind of uh, blown out of proportion in like as people's perception, and it's just not really connected to reality?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated issue. I mean, right? Because I mean, we unfortunately I don't have statistics in front of me, but I mean, we found not the majority, but like a pretty solid minority of folks we talked to didn't use drugs at all. Um, but there are a couple things. I mean, in some cases, people had pre-existing kind of substance use issues and became unhoused, maybe as a result of that, maybe not. For sure, people's substance use gets worse, but if they were using before, and sometimes people even initiate drug use um, as a result of being unhoused. One of the things that was really interesting that we had found was that there actually are I mean, I hate to use the word like positive aspects of like methamphetamine and things like that, but what I was going to say is that going back to the issue we were talking about before of having the importance of community and having people who that you can that have your back. Substance use is a way to do that. I mean, in middle class culture, you go out for drinks with people and you kind of bond over that, or you share a cigarette or things like that. So that's part of the issue. But the other thing that really struck us was that people, it kind of seems counterintuitive that people would use drugs, especially like methamphetamine, as for safety reasons. Mm. The reason for that is that they didn't feel safe sleeping at night. That if you slept at night, somebody's going to come and steal your stuff. They might beat you up. You might be sexually assaulted. And so people would stay up all night, and they would use meth or other kinds of uppers to do that. So this was kind of a strategic use of a substance to stay awake in order to keep themselves safe, that kind of thing. Likewise, some people, people segment themselves a little bit into their kind of substance of choice, just like they do in the rest of society. But we talked to some people who were kind of heavy drinkers who had switched to other kinds of drugs because they felt they were too vulnerable, right? I mean, like you drink too much and you pass out, no telling what could happen to you. So they switched to something else. So the kind of panorama of like reasons why people use, like whether it increases, et cetera, it's complicated. But for sure, I think anytime people are placed in an emotionally and psychologically stressful situation, one of the responses to that is self-medication. And the other part is that people will often, they self-medicate psychologically, but also self-medicating for other types of things like ADHD and things like that, where they're not receiving medication and they use illicit drugs for that. And I have to say that part of the reason that the stereotype exists is because people, by definition, who are outside and unhoused, are visible to public view. I mean, I can smoke fentanyl in my house all I want to, and nobody would necessarily know that. The police wouldn't know that. I mean, unless I guess they could, but it's very easy. You walk by an encampment and you see people using it. It's like, well, see, like everybody's using it. It's like, yeah, because you're just walking. You're basically walking into their house, and we all have secrets that we keep within our four walls, right? But they don't have the luxury of that.
Yeah, I mean, this makes total sense. I could see basically each of the components of what you're saying about use like about not about the kind of the desire for like in middle class it's often like you go get drinks, but like a lot of social outlets and maybe those getting slowly deteriorated. And that could also be a factor, like I could see that being a factor both in causing mental health and even also causing homelessness because it's like people who are getting slipped through the cracks who don't have other social safety because your family or friends are communities of people that can help, but not everyone has that same access. But I could also see like using medication whether that's self-medicating for ADHD, because like methamphetamine is similar to Adderall, which is a medication for ADHD.
For sure.
It's to just kind of self-protection, to wanting to numb the pain. I mean, with that idea, I'm reminded of people like I remember actually another one of my professors. She did a lot of research in, I think it was Sri Lanka, and she talked about like she did a lot of research among like the kids in a certain slum in one of the cities there, and she would talk about how they would take narcotics. Some of these kids may have had housing, and some of them may have not, but they were living in poverty either way. And basically, it was, they couldn't afford the food, and so narcotics was a way to make their stomach not feel like painfully hungry. And some of your examples seem kind of in that kind of wheelhouse. It's like preventing the
Yeah.
pain, basically, of that kind of experience.
Yeah. I mean, we have models like that to go in terms, of, especially the hunger part, which doesn't really come up with homelessness that I've heard, but like, that goes back to the Industrial Revolution, where like tea or coffee with sugar in it was distributed as a way of kind of staving off hunger, and so hence the origin of the coffee break and things like that.
Mm, I did not know that. Okay.
Uh,
I guess so. I don't drink caffeine, so maybe this is another good reason I have stayed away from coffee. But like, I could see like it's staving off that. I mean, but there are people who use drugs in their own homes, and it's not as visible. I wonder if there have been any studies that try to compare drug usage among like housed versus unhoused communities specifically, to see if it's actually higher, because sometimes our perception, like I'm reminded of the well, you had the really famous book that I'm blanking on the name of, that came up on that talked about this for like a regular audience, but among, the academic community has analyzed this for a while, but like, we'll say black urban communities, they have a much higher incarceration rate for drug offenses, but they don't have like a higher usage of drugs than
that's right.
most other, say, we'll say white communities. This is also the case with Latino communities in urban places too. But the police are there more, and they arrest because they have much more of a presence in those communities. The police do, and so I this seems like a type of parallel. It's like people see it more with people who are unhoused, and it wouldn't surprise me if they actually don't have a higher usage than regular people at all.
Yeah, and that ties in with the carceral system, because I mean, one of the things that we also find is that people kind of cycle in and out of the carceral system, and for the same reason, right? I mean, because you're publicly exposed, I mean, um, and they got and then, it's surprisingly easy to find people who are unhappy. If you think about it, I mean, like, you know, and because the people who are unhoused are poor, or even people who are housed and poor, I mean, probation officers will come and frisk you, and if they find something, then you're back at square one again, or if you miss, an appointment, that kind of a thing. And so um, that's another thing that really that keeps people in the system, is the fact that we have this kind of carceral solution to a lot of these issues, and people can't. It's very hard for people to kind of get past that one, because once you're in once, it's very hard to kind of stay out.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I could see that with like sweeps and things. But I could also just see like if you're homeless and you were in prison, so you're now in the probation system, say, those appointments are super important, and I could see, people who are homeless can sometimes have trouble with appointments, given the logistics of their lives and how that impacts their ability to be in a certain place at a certain time. Um, so that in and of itself could put them in trouble. Like you were saying, yeah. Um,
Yeah, it's a good point. the technological aspect of it, like, appointments and things like that, because that also is a barrier to getting housed in the first place. A lot of times people have case managers and they can't reach their clients because, people have phones, sometimes they get stepped on, they're not charged, so sometimes people, there's no place to get electricity, those kind of things. So like even just like communication networks that we just take for granted. There's I have an appointment, I need to show up at this place, or I can always reach out to somebody by text or phone. It is something that people don't always have because of the precarity of telecommunications for people who aren't housed.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's the ubiquity of the current system of, we use these sets of technology, but it isn't necessarily um, accessible for everyone.